lecture. And we are moving now to the Near East with Barbara Helwing, who will speak about the early copper industry in Southwest Asia, a regional and supra-regional system.
Yeah, good afternoon. I also wish to begin my talk with extending my heartfelt thanks to Professor Wang and to Jing in particular for being so persistent, and to you all for listening to this here. And when I was asked to present a lecture here, we had this exchange where I said, well, I've worked on the Neolithic for the last almost 10 years. So I decided to go back to a topic I had worked on before. And I think we can add always, even when we revisit old work, that we can come up with some new perspectives. And this is what I hope I can do here today. So talking about the early copper industry in Southwestern Asia and revisiting some of the old paradigms. So if you want to understand, oh no, I move, where do I move? This? Okay. So when we investigate copper industry and we want to investigate the whole process of metal production, we have to take a few parameters into consideration. One is, where can this copper be found and then processed, and where is it used and where do we find it? And all too often, all these different places are not in the same geographical spot. So this is, let's say, my starting observation. And we have at this conference already heard two lectures that were investigating metal production. This was one by Berenice Bellina and the other by Thomas Price. And you will see that I'm pretty much arguing along the same lines as these two colleagues, who both also emphasized what they call the French School of an Anthropology of Techniques. So this is also the stance that I'm taking here. And they also both have, so what you see here on the screen is more or less the outline of what I want to tell you. And what they have emphasized, the two of them also, is the role that metal plays in the cultural process. So what we do today here is to revisit the area that was really paradigmatic for formulating this model, and this is Southwest Asia. We will look at how the metal was processed and used in what we generally popularly call the first cities, and then go and visit the supply area, which is not the same because it's in the highlands. And it is from a combination of these two observations that we can reconstruct metalwork as a complex and integrated system that unites several regions. So again, going back to the very roots of this French School of an Anthropology of Techniques or Technology, here you have the grandfathers of the model, the sociologist and anthropologist Marcel Mauss, and André Leroy-Gourand, himself a prehistorian and also anthropologist, who came up and refined a model that in French is known as chaîne opératoire, or the operational chain. So this model has been sleeping, you could say, for a couple of decades and has been applied mostly in lithic studies, and it's only over the last 30 years or so that it's also entering other material studies. The beauty of the model is that it unites material and social considerations. So you have a focus on raw material shaping and artifact, but you have impact factors from both sides, from the society demanding them and from the technical properties and the skills available. So this is, so to say, the father model. When we talk about metallurgy, there is one factor that distinguishes metal from other materials, and that is that metal can be reused. And the first to formulate this explicitly was Barbara Ottaway, who came up with this model of a cycle, because we all know you can melt metal and you can remelt it, and the whole process is not infinite, some loss is always there, but metal can circulate for quite a while. And because there's also constantly new input to it, I have modified this model in this way, saying that there's a constant influx into this cycle by rock being mined for ores, and this ore then processed, extracted, and entered into this circle. So the metallurgical cycle, as Barbara Ottaway had called it, really takes us from the rock to the object and beyond. But if we look at it properly, then we also see that it's, oh, there's something missing on this slide, got lost somewhere in the translation process, because what I wanted to show here is that 3/4 of this cycle are not visible to us archaeologically. What we have as visible evidence are very often the objects that are filtered through the context from which they come. But the rock, the mine, the ore, the extraction process, all this can only be studied in an indirect way from indirect evidence, which is the holes that we identify as mines, the tools that are lying around after extracting the ores, the furnaces that have been used, the processing residues, etc. So, and in the lower part of the slide, you can also see that there are even less visible evidences that are included in the objects, and where you need to apply a lot of scientific and lab technology to extract this meaning. So only about 1/4 of the whole process is really visible. And when we then come and try to apply the operational chain questions, what is the social demand and what is the technical conditions that allow or that determine how this cycle is running, then you see that there is a lot of different factors impacting on what we see. On the social side, you see that metal is very often linked with the need for prestigious items, more so than for utilitarian tools or weapons. But a demand has to be there before it's being produced. On the technical side, we also see that there is the skills and the materials involved, and a concept that is known under the name of cross-craft interaction. It has been introduced like this by Anne Brisbane and some colleagues, about how different technological categories kind of influence each other or cross-influence each other. There would be skills like making pottery, knowing about pyrotechnology, but also transport facilities, heavily impacting on how this chain plays out. So I think I don't need to introduce in detail the 3H system and to this audience, but we all know also that the determining factor for distinguishing world prehistory into a Stone Age, a Bronze Age, and an Iron Age is the material used for cutting tools. And on the right, from your side, on the right, you see Christian Jürgensen Thomsen just explaining the collection in the Copenhagen National Museum. We are in the first half of the 19th century. And yesterday, Thomas Price already also alluded to another big figure in prehistoric archaeology, Gordon Child, who included metal production in one of his 10 points on the bucket list of what makes a city. And so I have just a quote from his Urban Revolution text here, where he says that the city is necessary to provide space for specialists. And from there, it's just one step forward to, I use Child's original map here to see where is metal appearing in the first place. So this is really the paradigmatic paper on this. And we have here in the lowlands of the alluvial plain between Euphrates and Tigris, we have the cities that are behind many of the early urban models altogether. And the period when this happens here on the left, we start with the early cities in the Uruk period. We then see a period of kind of standardization happening, that in the lowlands we call Jemdet Nasa, and we move on into the third millennium with what we call early dynastic 1, 2, 3. And so this very paradigmatic city, Uruk proper, has a number of characteristics that we are all familiar with. We are in the lower, we are in the lower floodplains here. We have an enormous site with a sacred precinct, and we have now also evidence for a social stratification, and in particular for the existence of people who have the duty to lead the community. And I give you two images on the right, also quite iconic images. And on the next slide, you see what is really the duty of these people, who are always standing out in the iconography by this bearded man with a cap, is the same figure that we also see on seal impressions in the upper right. This person is not just an elite person. This person has the duty to take care of the public monumental buildings that popularly are usually called the temples. And on the left, you see a reconstruction of one such temple, of which we have a whole sequence of them in the city of Uruk proper. So with the emergence of this kind of elite and the building of temples as a huge communal work, we also see here that these temples are very often decorated in a very elaborate way. On the right, you see the classic stone cones that are known, that Uruk is very well known for, these facades. But there's also a lot of metal that's being used to embellish wooden furniture and other things in the temple. So metal is a topic. We also have elite objects like silver spouted jars, seals, and other things being produced and being used in this site. Now, how important is this metal industry in the early cities? When we look at written evidence, and this is where we have better evidence than in any of the surrounding areas, we see that the Sumerians, when they started to write, they started also to write all kinds of lists for categories of birds. So among these lists are lists for animals and lists for plants, and there's even a list just for fish. But there's also a very famous one, and that's the list of professions. And this list was used to canonize words and to also was then used to teach new generations of scribes. So what I show you here is a tablet with one of these lists that dates a few hundred years later, but goes back to lists that were already used in the Uruk period. And you read these tablets from the upper left corner, the column down, and then the second and the third, and so on. So what's interesting about these lists is that they are organized in a hierarchical way. So they start in the upper left corner with the most important person in the city. That is the Ain, or it is also called the Nameshta. That is this leading figure with all these duties of taking care of the temple. And then come a number of officials, mostly involved with organizing the temple work. But then in positions from 29 onwards, so this is the red square here, we have 5 positions allocated to people working with metal. And the interesting thing is that this group is the first group that's being mentioned as craftsmen working with their hands after the big temple officials. Then follow more smaller temple officials. And at the end of the list, for example, you would have herdsmen and these people taking care of the fields. So hierarchically, people working with metal are pretty high up in the scene. And if we then look at what's written, otherwise we see that there are several kinds of smiths. They are related with the idea of, also of working wood. So silver working and woodworking is together. But what's very interesting also from all these texts we have for the 4th and 3rd millennium is that the Sumerian smiths never work on ores. They always work on processed material. And this is my switch now to say, so where does this all come from? And the answer is pretty easy. Insofar as we all know, there is no copper ore available in the lowlands. It's found in the mountains. And we have here throughout Anatolia, throughout Iran, and then running all the way over to India, we have a geological formation that is generally termed the Tethyan-Eurasian metallogenic belt, which you can see as this gray band stretching through. And obviously, this is where we should look for the ores. And this is where I want to take you now. So here on a map, you see the star is where Uruk stands, just representing prototypically all these early cities that spring up in the lowlands. But the areas where we have evidence for metal working, metal extraction, and metal processing also is all located in the highlands, in this case of Iran. And to illustrate what I mean, I will take you to a project that was conducted as a joint Iranian-German project between 2000 and 2004 by the German Archaeological Institute and the Iranian Center for Archaeological Research combined, plus all these institutions listed here. On the right, you see a view of the site. You see that it's a site covered with slag heaps. We are at an elevation of 1,000 meters above sea level. The tiny mountains in the back rise up to 4,000 meters. And this is where we investigated over 7 seasons this settlement site, which is quite extensive and which has a sort of horizontal stratigraphy with a settlement moving through space and moving with probably the availability of water. So we did geophysics and we did also a lot of surveying, and we come up with this topographical map. So with the big squares in the background, you see each square is 100 meters. So this is a huge site really moving through the landscape. The oldest part is area B, which is the Chalcolithic site. And then there's area C as the transition to the early Bronze Age site. And what we learned from here is that we can see a very clear difference between the older phases where we have individual houses and tiny workshops in the Chalcolithic, a shift to let's say a pre-planned settlement, all the houses being allocated more or less similar spots, standardized bricks, etc. And it is this phase that is also related to the first evidence for furnace smelting before we have tiny little pit furnaces. So bringing all this evidence together, we can say we have here good evidence for huge smelting operations in a big slag heap. We have a production of a good 180 tons of slag. We have materials related to the processing of the metal, which are cushion stones here on the upper, up there. We have molds, and then we have scrap metal as well. So if we sort it all into a system, we can see that there is a very strong shift between these two periods. So when we enter the early Bronze Age, or comparative with Jamded Nasr, we would have a mass production of flat axes in these molds that you can see on the right. And here, once more, sorted a bit better in a chronological order. So you see our area B and the area C, and in between we have this switch from individual workshops to larger scale organization. So the metallurgical cycle here, again, is represented then with just those things that are outlined in yellow. And we can use this to shoot all kinds of analysis at the material. So we see here that our slags from the site of Arisman are not the same that are being used in the site of Tapesiark, that's only 60 kilometers apart. And we can reconstruct from the lead isotope evidence that there are at least 8 different sources providing ores to this site. This is only possible. So most of them come from this lower right section of the map. This is only possible because at the same time, we have now first evidence for domesticated donkey here. And this brings me back to the methodological cycle saying, if you look at transport facilities, this is what really changes the picture of bringing in now these ores from far away in larger quantities. Similar crossover effects are visible by people using household techniques like millstones that you see on the upper, also pottery technology to create molds and furnaces as well. So we see that there's a very simple transfer of technology adding here to the metal industry. When we then look into the distribution of this production, we see that we do not find any of the shaft hole axes that were produced in the older period on the Iranian plateau anywhere in the neighborhood, but we find them in prestige tombs in Susa, or more recently also in the Zora project. So we have now 2 places where we see the consumption of these huge and very heavy copper axes. All this goes straight down to the lowlands. However, when we enter this moment of a more standardized industry type evidence, much smaller, lighter, flat axes are being produced, and they are not found anymore in Susa or Uruk. They are all traveling along the foothills of the Piedmont Mountains to the EB1 sites in northern Syria mainly, and also in northern Mesopotamia. And this correlates with evidence here for cylinder seals. As you see, all these 3 seals shown on the lower part of the slide come from the site of Arisman proper. So there is now an established exchange with these regions. But there is more evidence for relations, and this now goes back to the site of Susa, where we do not have the copper anymore that we find in the highlands, but we see that a silver production, a very refined jewelry production is known from Susa, and we find also 1 such nice silver pendant in Arisman, 1 in Siak, 1 in the Kunji cave. So I think this illustrates nicely. This illustrates quite nicely that there is now a flow back and forth of materials. So we have the production of the raw materials on the highlands. We have the distribution along the Piedmont zone. We are still in this period around 3000. But we also have in the early cities like Susa, like Uruk, we have a refining industry. And it seems as if this refined material is then finding its way back to the production centers in the highlands. So if you look at it like this, we should be aware that we are talking distances of a high mountain chain in between, and also something like 500 to 1,000 kilometers travel for these materials. And I think what I wanna get down to in the end is basically what we have also seen for the Kra Isthmus, that this is a combined system. We will not understand any of this if we look at it just in detail at one site. We need to now combine the evidence from the Mesopotamian cities with the highland evidence, and this is what I hope to do in the near future. Thank you. So bringing it together,